Good morning, all. So, our class today is dural folds and venous sinuses. So, I suggest you before hearing this class, you should go through the cranial fossa and you should be familiar with all these terms seen or used inside the cranial cavity, the bony prominences especially. Okay, so with that, I'll come to the dural folds. I hope the word dura is familiar to you. When you open the vault, you are expecting to see the brain, and covering the brain, there will be meninges. And the outermost or the toughest will be the dura, and inside that, there will be arachnoid and the pia. Okay, and that much you know. But what you should know now is this dura matter is again gives rise to some folds that goes into the cranial cavity. They are called the dural folds, and there are some venous sinuses related to these dural folds. Okay, the dura mater of the brain, it has got two layers. One is attached to the vault, the bone. It is called the periosteal layer or the endosteal layer, and there is another layer that goes along with the arachnoid and the pia, so it is called the meningeal layer. I am telling you, it is only about the dura mater of the cranial cavity. So can you say where else can you see the dura mater other than inside the cranial cavity? Yes, the continuation of the brain is the spinal cord. Covering the spinal cord, there is also the same dura, arachnoid and pia, but the dura is only having the meningeal layer. Inside the cranial cavity, there is an endosteal layer and meningeal layer. Okay, and these meningeal layer, it folds upon itself. It is thrown into a fold that goes between the spaces inside the brain, and that will form the dural fold. So naturally, a dural fold will be double layered. Okay, so this meningeal layer gave rise to the dural folds, and it is double layered. And these dural folds, this is a picture interior showing the interior of the cranial cavity with all these brain matter removed, so that you can see these dural folds. Okay, only if you understand, only if you know about these dural folds, you can understand. Otherwise, it is difficult. Okay, and what is the function of these dural folds? These dural folds, it divides the cranial cavity into several compartments. Though incomplete, it divides the cranial cavity into several compartments. Then next thing is the brain matter is actually jelly-like. So this gives some support to the brain. Okay. Now this is another picture. It is an imaginary picture where the dural fold, not imaginary, you can see such specimens, but it's a diagrammatic representation, you can say, where these dural folds were taken out from the cranial cavity so that it will be easier for you to understand. There are 4 dural folds that you should remember. You should not forget. Okay, the names you should not forget. You should study these terms. One is the falx cerebri. Falx cerebri, it is very easy. Falx means it is sickle shaped. I will come to it later. Cerebri, whenever you are thinking about the brain, there is a right half and a left half. It is called the two cerebral hemispheres. So there will be naturally a longitudinal fissure between these two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so this fold goes between two cerebral hemispheres, so that is why it is called falx cerebri. This is the falx cerebri, the most prominent and easy to see. Now come similarly lower down, this is the falx cerebelli. So from the word you might be understanding that it is seen between two cerebellar hemispheres. though inconspicuous, and it is very difficult to see. Next is tendorium cerebelli. This is the tendorium cerebelli. Again, from the word tendorium means tend like, a tend over the cerebellum. Okay, that is tendorium cerebelli. It comes between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, or the posterior part of cerebrum. Okay, so you can remember it is a tent like over the cerebellum. Then the fourth one is the diaphragma cellae. Again, from the word, it is like a diaphragm. Diaphragm to what? To a cella. Cella means a space, cavity, a shelf. For what? There's a shelf-like space or cella turcica for the pituitary gland in the middle cranial fossa. So, diaphragm to that cella. This is the place for the diaphragma cellae. So, these are the four folds of the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Okay. Now about the falx cerebri. The falx cerebri, you should know the shape and location. Shape, it is similar to this one. This is the falx or the sickle shape. Okay, with a narrow anterior end and a broad posterior end. The narrow anterior end is attached to the crista galli. Refer to your cranial fossa. Okay, that is a narrow anterior end. Then broad posterior end, that you can see, that broad posterior end is attached to the superior surface of tendorium cerebelli. So because of this attachment and pull, the tendorium, the tent-like structure has been maintained. Okay. And location, you know, it is between the two cerebral hemispheres. Then parts, again it is the same with two ends, anterior, narrow anterior end and broad posterior end. Two borders, a superior border which is attached to the bone and an inferior border which is free and hanging between two cerebral hemispheres. Two surfaces, right and left. About the attachments, whenever you asked about the attachments, you should say the anterior end is attached to crista galli, posterior end is attached to the tendorium cerebelli, then the superior border is attached to the vault of the skull. Okay, also between the vault in the midline. Between the vault in the midline and the crista galli, there is a frontal crest. Posteriorly, it reaches up to the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, the posterior end is attached to the tendorium cerebelli. The attached border, it reaches posteriorly up to the internal occipital protuberance. Don't confuse between these two. Now about the tendorium cerebelli. When you remove the falx cerebri, this will be the picture. This will be the tent over the posterior cranial fossa, over the cerebellum. The shape, it is tent shape. Location, it is in the posterior cranial fossa, above the cerebellum or between the cerebellum and cerebrum. Surfaces, it has got a superior and inferior surface. Now about the borders. It has got a posterior border which is attached to the bone, and it has got an anterior border which is free. Okay, so you can say than posterior anterior border, the posterior, you can say it as attached border and free border. The attached border has got a posterior part and an anterolateral part. Okay, so you can see the attached border, it starts from, this is the occipital part. Okay, posteriorly it is attached to the occipital part. Anterolaterally, this is the petrous bone. So superior border of petrous bone, and it reaches up to the posterior clinoid process. Okay, now comes the free border. Free border, this is the free border. You can see there is a free border. It reaches up to the anterior clinoid process. Okay, so that is the posterior border or the attached border. You can say it is attached border because there is a posterior part which is attached to the occipital bone, and there is an anterolateral part which is attached to the petrous temporal bone. Okay, it reaches up to the posterior clinoid process. The free border, it is an anterior border, it reaches up to the anterior clinoid process. And you can see there is a space, a U-shaped space in front of the free border. It is called the tentorial notch. Okay. What else should you know about the tentorium cerebelli? The tentorium cerebelli divides the cranial cavity into a supratentorial part and an infratentorial part. Okay, and the part of the brain that passes through the tentorial notch is the midbrain of the brainstem. Now, one more thing is, in the cranial cavity, the tentorium cerebelli is pushed and form a cave-like space by the trigeminal ganglion. Okay, so this is the yellow color thing is the trigeminal ganglion. So it make a cave, a space with the tentorium cerebelli, and that cave is called the trigeminal cave or the cavum trigeminale. Okay, so this is the points, and this cave is also called the Meckel's cave. Now the diaphragma cellae. The diaphragma cellae, it is a diaphragm over the pituitary fossa in the middle cranial fossa. Attachment, if you have seen the sella turcica or the pituitary fossa in the bone, you know anteriorly it is bounded by the tuberculum cellae and posteriorly the dorsum cellae. Naturally, this diaphragma cellae is attached to anteriorly to the tuberculum cellae and posteriorly to dorsum cellae. And there will be an opening in the middle for the passage of the pituitary stalk. This is the picture of these entire dural folds. You can see the falx cerebri, which is the largest and sickle shaped, and the tentorium cerebelli on either side. Anteriorly, it is connected to that clinoid process. Where it is connected to that clinoid process, there is a diaphragma cellae, where there is an opening in the center. It is for the pituitary stalk, and here there is a tentorial notch. It is marked here as incisura tentoria, and lower down there is a small falx cerebelli. So the falx cerebelli, it is very difficult to see when you do the dissection. When you open that skull, it is very small, very thin, but it will be there. So it starts from, so the picture you are seeing is the interior of the occipital bone, and this is the internal occipital protuberance, and this falx cerebri is attached from the internal occipital protuberance to the foramen magnum. So that line, that is called the internal occipital crest. Okay, very thin and inconspicuous. Now the venous sinuses. So these were the things about the dural folds, the bare minimum. The rest you can read from the text. At least you should remember at least this much. Now the venous sinuses. Between these two layers of dura, there are some veins or venous pools. They are called the venous sinuses. Okay, between the majority of them are between the endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Some of them are between two layers of meningeal layer. Okay, so these venous sinuses, they are lined by an endothelium, similar to any other vessels in your body. There will be an endothelium lining, but unlike the veins in your body, there is no muscle tissue in its wall. There is no valves in these venous sinuses. Okay, only thing is it is the venous blood and there is an endothelium that covers. Now you can classify into unpaired and paired sinuses. Unpaired, naturally it will be seen in the midline, mid-sagittal plane. Okay, they will be single, they are called unpaired sinuses. If they are seen on laterally, you can say there will be a right one and a left one. They are called paired sinuses. So these are the unpaired sinus. You can see this is a sagittal section, mid-sagittal section, and it has imaginary drawing. In the midline, above you can see the superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, then straight sinus. Lower down it is the occipital sinus, We will come to all these later. Anterior intercavernous, posterior intercavernous and basilar plexus. All these are the unpaired sinus. You should remember all these occupy the mid-sagittal plane. Now about the paired sinuses seen on either side. Now we are taking a coronal section so that you can see in the middle cranial fossa. In the diagram it is very prominent, but during dissection it cannot be seen this much. These are called the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus. Then these are the transverse sinus, right and left. Then sigmoid sinus because of that S-shaped curve. Then superior petrocell because of the it is the location along the superior border of petrous bone. Inferior petrocell. Then sphenoparietal sinus. This is sphenoparietal sinus, and there will be middle meningeal veins. All these are examples of paired venous sinuses seen on right and left side. In detail about the superior sagittal sinus. Superior sagittal sinus, you can see the location. It starts from, this is the crista galli. Crista galli located here. Then it is going along the attached border of falx cerebri. Then it reaches up to the internal occipital protuberance. Okay, so all along this fold it reaches up to the internal occipital protuberance. That is the superior sagittal sinus. And I think now you can say, is it paired or unpaired? Yes, it is unpaired. Where is it seen? It is seen along the attached border. It is seen in the midline. And extent is from the crista galli to internal occipital protuberance. At the internal occipital protuberance, there is a confluence of sinuses, that is meeting of several sinuses, or there will be a dilatation of these sinus. It is called the confluence of sinus. Now, when we are talking about the tributaries and communications, in general, you should know here, yes, see, this is your superior sagittal sinus. The superior sagittal sinus. Okay, it is seen between the two layers of dura mater. Okay, now when we are talking about the tributaries, one will be, I'll come to it. This is the emissary vein. I hope you have heard about the emissary vein when you learn about scalp. That is the connecting veins between the scalp and the intracranial venous sinuses. So naturally, this will be draining into the venous sinuses. These are the emissary vein coming from the scalp. Second is the veins that is draining from the cerebrum. They are called the cerebral veins. They also will be draining. Third set will be the diploic veins. What are the diplo? Diplo means the bone marrow cavity of a flat bone. Okay, so these veins draining from the marrow cavity in the vault, they are called the diploic veins. All these will be draining into the venous sinuses. Here you can see the emissary veins and diploic veins. They are draining into as another pocket of this venous sinus. They are called the lacuna. They will be draining into the sagittal sinus. Then another feature peculiar for the superior sagittal sinus is this arachnoid granulation. What is arachnoid granulation? You can see in this picture there is a bulbous projection of a green colored thing which represent the arachnoid matter into the sagittal sinus. These bulbar projections or the granular projections from the arachnoid matter, they are called the arachnoid granulations, and it is important functionally because it is an important channel for the drainage of the CSF present inside the subarachnoid space. Now, I told you something about confluence of sinuses. So, at the internal occipital protuberance, there are several sinuses meeting of 5 sinuses, you can say. They are the superior sagittal sinus, right and left transverse sinus, straight sinus, and the occipital sinus. Sometimes they meet, sometimes they won't, but you can see there is a dilatation there. Because what we expect is the meeting at this space. Sometimes what happens is superior sagittal sinus continues as the right transverse sinus and the straight sinus continues as the left transverse sinus. Then all these will not meet here, but you can say that it is a confluence and it is the meeting of these five sinuses. Now location of all these, just remember that superior sagittal, we told you it is along the upper attached border of the falx cerebri. Inferior sagittal sinus, you can see it is along the free inferior border of falx cerebri. Can you see that? Okay. Now about the straight sinus, at the junction of the falx with the tentorium cerebelli. So I hope you know the superior sagittal. This is the inferior sagittal sinus and this is the straight sinus. Okay, the straight sinus. Then the occipital sinus along the internal occipital crest, lower down. Then about the transverse sinus, this is the transverse sinus along the posterior attached border of the tentorium. Then this is the superior petrosal sinus along the superior border of petrous temporal bone. This is the sigmoid sinus, S-shaped. This can be seen only if you remove the tentorium cerebelli. Okay. Then this is the cavernous sinus on either side. This is the position of the straight sinus. Sigmoid sinus, the continuation of transverse sinus deep to the mastoid. Superior petrosal along the attached border of the tentorium cerebelli. Now cavernous sinus, you should know about cavernous sinus in detail. A usual essay question or a short essay question for you, cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is seen in the middle cranial fossa on either side of the body of sphenoid and the pituitary gland. It is sponge-like because it is divided into several spaces by several septa. It is divided into spaces, and in the living it like a sponge, and in the dead you may not be able to appreciate it. These spaces are called caverns, that is why it is called cavernous sinus. And the extent of this cavernous sinus, it extends from, here comes the superior orbital fissure, anteriorly from the medial end of superior orbital fissure to the orbit, and posteriorly up to the petrous apex. So this is the extent, 2 cm by 1 cm. Okay, this is the position of the cavernous sinus, extend from the superior orbital fissure to the petrous apex. Then relation interior, you should know to draw this cavernous sinus, this picture. Any picture from any textbook, but all these features should be there. Okay, this cavernous sinus, you can say there is a roof, it has a floor, it has got a medial wall, and it has got a lateral wall. And you can see in the picture, the lateral wall is continuous with the roof and the floor is continuous with the medial wall. Okay, and the roof and the lateral wall is formed by the meningeal layer, and the floor and medial wall is formed by the endosteal layer of the dura mater. Okay, and when you're talking about the relations, you should divide this into 3 groups. One is seen inside as a content of the sinus, cavernous sinus. Second one, the structure seen in its lateral wall, between the endothelium and the dura mater. Then third is the external relation, outside. Okay, so what is seen in the inside? It is the internal carotid artery. When you are writing the answer, don't use the short forms. It is the internal carotid artery and the abducens nerve. And in the lateral wall, there is the third cranial nerve, fourth means oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, and I have written it as 5-1 and 5-2. 5 is trigeminal, first division of trigeminal is ophthalmic, second division is maxillary. All these are seen on the lateral wall of the sinus. Now the external relation, medially, here you can see there is a pituitary gland, that orange color, and the sphenoidal air sinus. All these are very important for a surgical approach. Then laterally, lateral to the lateral wall, there is the uncus of the temporal lobe of the brain. Superiorly, there is again this internal carotid artery, though it is seen inside, it pierces the roof and it comes posteriorly, so it is also related above and the optic chiasma. Inferiorly, there is a foramen lacerum. Now, tributaries, communications, and drainage channels. When you're talking about the tributaries, the vein that drains into the cavernous sinus, you can divide it into three groups. One is coming from the orbit, one comes from the meninges, and the other comes from the brain. Okay, from the orbit, I hope when you have studied the face, you have seen the dangerous area of face, you have learned the superior ophthalmic vein and inferior ophthalmic vein that drain to the cavernous sinus. In addition to that, there is a central retinal vein. These three are coming from the orbit. Okay, then from the meninges, you have seen that sphenoparietal sinus and the middle meningeal vein. From the brain, the superficial middle meningeal vein and the inferior cerebral veins. At least you remember that it is the middle and the inferior cerebral veins. These are the three sets of veins that drain into the cavernous sinus. Okay, now there are communications. Communication, again, the dangerous area of face, there was a communication from the deep facial vein. Here in this picture also, that has been written in red in the midline. Can you see? Between these cavernous sinuses, there is intercavernous sinus. Intercavernous, anterior and posterior intercavernous sinuses. They are the communications. Second, this is the communication with the facial vein. Remember, the deep facial vein through the pterygoid venous plexus and through the emissary veins, it communicates. Okay, another set, it is the internal vertebral venous plexus through the basilar plexus, it also communicates. Okay, that can go on either way because with respect to the pressure difference, that is why they are called communications. And the third set is drainage channels. This cavernous sinus drain too. In some textbook, it also is included under communications. There are these two. That is, there is a connection, posteriorly you can see, at the junction of transverse sinus and sigmoid sinus, there is a connection, that is a superior petrosal sinus. And lower down, the sigmoid sinus goes out and continues as the internal jugular vein. And there, the inferior petrosal sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus, it also goes out and drain into the internal jugular vein as a first tributary of internal jugular vein. Okay, so you should know that the transverse sinus continues as sigmoid sinus and the sigmoid sinus goes out through the jugular fossa as the internal jugular vein. And I hope you know you have seen the internal jugular vein when you have done the dissection of the neck. That internal jugular vein, you can take that as a continuation of these dural venous sinuses. So now I hope you remember the tributaries, communications, and drainage channels of the cavernous sinus. Now about the applied importance, this is a most cavernous sinus thrombosis. Next is lateral sinus thrombosis. What is lateral sinus? Lateral sinus is one. You can take it as transverse sinus and the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus lies deep to the mastoid very close to the facial nerve, cerebellum and all. So the mastoiditis, the middle ear infections that can lead to that thrombosis of the sigmoid sinus. It is called lateral sinus thrombosis. Then pulsating exophthalmos means there are veins draining from the orbit into the cavernous sinus, and inside the cavernous sinus there is an internal carotid artery. So when there is an internal carotid aneurysm and when it breaks inside, what happens? The cavernous sinus will be filled with this arterial blood. So that will backflow to the orbit or the eyeball, and the eyeball will start pulsating along with the internal carotid artery pulsation. Okay, so it is a type of arteriovenous fistula inside the cavernous sinus. So it is called exophthalmos, means the eyeball is protruding. Here it is pulsating along with the internal carotid artery. So it is called the pulsating exophthalmos. Okay, and about the cavernous sinus thrombosis in detail. Cavernous sinus thrombosis, now you know there are communications into the cavernous sinus from the dangerous area of face, from the meninges, from the orbit and all these. So any infection in that region can lead to thrombosis of the cavernous sinus, and it is called cavernous sinus thrombosis. And why is it dangerous? Because that is why you should know about the structures that is seen inside and on the lateral wall. There will be ophthalmoplegia. Ophthalmoplegia means there are some nerves related or lying in the lateral wall. Third, fourth nerve and sixth inside. All these are going to supply the extraocular muscles that moves the eyeball. So when all these nerves are affected, that will lead to ophthalmoplegia, that cannot move the eyeball. Necrosis, because of the third nerve, there will be drooping of the eyelid. Again, the third nerve, because of that affected, there will be fixed and dilated pupil. Okay. Then the ophthalmic veins is draining into that. So when that is thrombosed, that will backfire. So what happens? There will be exophthalmos, protruding of the eyeball. Then the central retinal vein also is draining into that. So when that is blocked, that retina will be edematous. It is called papilledema. So all these are very dangerous, and the entire thing together is known as cavernous, these conditions, cavernous sinus thrombosis. These are the features of the symptoms of the cavernous sinus thrombosis. So the entire thing, dural folds you should know, the venous sinuses you should have an idea, and the cavernous sinus in detail. Okay, thank you.